Okay, so we're now back looking at this particular position, and let us see uh, how we might do if we try to play this position against a strong computer opponent. I suggested that I had beaten the strong computer opponent with this position earlier. So, as it shows, I'm showing from this position, AI level 8, unlimited time with white, and I want to show that this position is really fairly easy regardless of how black tries to defend. So as we showed previously, and we see that he indeed goes to d6, finds that the strongest move. I go to e4, and once again, as you see, the pawn drops down, which is the move that I expected. Now, a good thing to think about is to show that pawn to f7 does not work because he can come to e7, he will be able to catch, and I will not be successful, and it will be a draw. So, king f5 is forced, and indeed he goes down. Now, in this position, if I try to catch his pawn, then he will have time to get my pawn. So I cannot afford to go down, but what I can do is I can push, forcing him to go here, and then I still have time to guard my pawn. So I actually have a pretty good choice, but what's the best choice? Is my best choice to move the king to g6 right away, or is it to move the pawn right away? Well, to tell you the truth, it actually doesn't matter because either way, white wins fairly easily, even though it's not as simple as it might seem. Now, what I mean by that is I'm thinking that if I move the pawn up and he comes over and I guard, I should be okay. But, what if he gets his king here? That means that he may actually be able to queen ahead of me. So, pushing the pawn is not a good idea right now because I have to be able to keep the pressure on this e7 square for a little bit longer. So instead of pushing the pawn, the king goes up, the king comes over, and now I should queen easily. And at this point, the game is fundamentally over. Now I can get behind the pawn easily. And it's an easy win for white. The king can defend the pawn, but not for very long. And white goes on to mate. So let's rewind here. Let's show why the other route doesn't. I suspect that the other route doesn't seem to work. Let's try this. By making this move, I'm giving black the square. Up, you see? And now black looks like he can win. In fact, he should win in this position. This should now actually be a win for black because if I stay on my own pawn, he will have time to promote. And I actually cannot catch his pawn in time. And black wins. So, in those two situations, those moves were not created equal. So, as we said earlier, it's crucial to be able to keep the defense on this particular square. So let's just look at a couple of alternative possibilities, right? So the computer may move the same each time, but I'm curious what would happen in terms of the defense if the computer, in fact, were to go here. So let's just assume, right, that he tries to cut it off and go around this way, right? That is a move. So let's look at this position instead and see what the difference is. And once again, still an easy win for white, but so once again, pawn cannot be pushed because then the king comes to e7, stops the pawn easily, and it will be a draw. So the king comes up to defend. Now in this position, because the computer is being smart and the computer is actually trying to maximize the number of moves while it's still alive, he actually abandons the pawn to its fate. Now, this is the problem with training against computers, is in winnable positions like this is considered the computer's strongest defense, not because it's actually the most sensible move, but it's trying to maximize the number of moves in which it's still alive in terms of delaying mate as long as possible. But this move, of course, just abandons the pawn, and white will go on to win easily. So that's the problem sometimes with computers. They don't always give the best sense of a defense. So in this position, right, so he comes up. The thing he would probably want to try to do is actually come on over to e8 to try to get behind the pawn. And then the king comes over. And this is now an easy win for white for a fairly simple reason. Once white pushes now to f7, he no longer, white has what's called the opposition. Now, if in this position it were white to move, this position is actually a draw. But that's the great thing about king and pawn endgames and the subtleties of this idea of opposition. Because white has the opposition when white pushes that pawn to f7, black now has to move again. And there's only one place, as you see, only one square where he can move. Now, white cannot promote immediately, otherwise black will just capture and it will be a stalemate. But the king gets to e7, and now the game is effectively over. So, those are some of the different ways in which white can overcome. Now, one of the more interesting things, I think, is actually the e5, just because it's different, because now what do I do? He's now coming over. I can't come up, so now I have to come over, and he comes down, and I have to be careful not to let him get the opposition. Now, clearly, I can't move my pawn forward. He'll take it, but what am I going to do? Am I going to come up this way and he's going to come over? Well, that will just put us in the same position as we were before. So let's say he comes this way. And we'll notice that once again, we're actually in opposition just from a different angle. So the best defense was what we showed earlier, the king d6 defense, after which you have king e4, and now he has a choice about what to do. He can either move back, or he can try to play e5 in order to try to get to the pawn. And e5, I think, is the much stronger continuation, because what it does is it forces white to have to make some difficult choices and gives white a chance to make some mistakes. If white captures the pawn here, it's a draw. And if white pushes the pawn here, it is also a draw. So that's why white has to exercise some patience. And the beautiful part is that even though now they will queen on the same turn, this check becomes absolute, in certain movements of the board, right? 1, 2, 1, 2. So on one hand, one might think, oh, well, shouldn't this be a draw because they'll queen within the same move? No, the answer is no, because the queening comes with check. And that is, again, the big difference. The fact that the queening comes with check is the reason why this is in fact a win for white instead of a draw. Now, if the king were on a different square, say right now the king were on the e5 square, then this might not be a draw. Actually, though, if the king were on the e5 square, it would still actually be a loss. And let me demonstrate why that might be. So I'm just going to waste a move here. Triangulate here so that All right. So all of those crazy moves were just to get us to the position where now the the pawn is on e5. In this position, it is also a win for white because of where the king is in relationship to the pawn. So earlier we said it was a loss because the queening comes with check. In this case, the alignment of the king and the queen spells doom for black. So promote, promote. And even though they queen within the same move, the problem is that the king cannot simultaneously, right, get out of the way of this file and promote at the same time. So let's say he promotes and check, and white wins. And if he tries to avoid that by, say, going here, then boom, it's now being guarded, and white will still win. Now, granted, it's not as easy now because of all of the things that black can try to do in order to prolong the game. But eventually, what will happen, inevitably, is that white will still be able to stop it. Now, in this position, I've messed up, and now it's a draw, if I'm not mistaken. Nope, not a draw. It's not a draw yet because this still works. Right? This still works because, unfortunately for black, now the pawn is pinned. And so there's still some shenanigans, and it can still be very difficult. But now in this position, what white can do is every single time that he attempts to get away from the pawn, the king can very slowly come over. Right? So it's tedious. It's a tedious exercise sometimes. But that's why you need a lot of endgame practice. So again, one of the key things about when we look at this position from all the way back, I really don't think that it's important to be able to calculate the entire line from this initial position. The most important thing to be able to look at in this position is to know that the clear path forward is f6, and then after he comes over, to know that one can use the use of this square and this pawn and the way the squares are being covered to be able to try to form cover for the pawn. So in review, this has shown us a lot of really cool things. It showed us opposition. It showed us some of the things about what to do in terms of the pawn endgame. But the big thing in this position, and the thing I would want anyone I was teaching chess, is to basically be able to find that initial strong move, f6, because the rest of the moves can really be almost not self-explanatory, but they can be able to be found just with use of some simple chess logic. So anyway, this was part 2 of that position, and it doesn't have a game listed. I just said E Pogosiance. I do not know who that is. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It says it's from 1981. I'll have to look that up to find the source. But this has been part 2 of this endgame tactic, and this is Chess Teacher Tui, and I want to wish you good luck with your chess and have a wonderful day.